Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. There are some absolutely incredible revenge games that we've talked about on this channel, where one player goes up against his former team after his former team wronged him in some capacity, and the player absolutely dominates and has one of the best games of their career. Quarterback Bob Lee, after being cut by the Vikings in a somewhat unfair way, signing with the Rams, then coming off of the bench to defeat his former team in overtime. Quarterback Joey Harrington, after being vilified in Detroit to the point where his own teammates were talking about how bad he was, going to the Dolphins and scoring 3 touchdowns on Thanksgiving. Fullback Larry Kennebrew, after Sam Weiss treated him like dirt in Cincinnati, going to Buffalo and destroying the Bengals on the ground in a winning effort. I would be here all day if I listed every single instance of a player doing something like this. But this video? This is not one of them. This is not one of those revenge games that went well. This is a revenge game that went incredibly poorly. Tony Reed spent 4 seasons in Kansas City, and was fuming during his time there about how he wasn't being utilized properly. When he finally got out of Kansas City and signed with the Denver Broncos, not only was he excited for a fresh start and to go to a team that looked like they might play him, but he was excited about being able to go up against his former team and division rival twice and stick it to them. Safe to say, he did not do that. And this is the story behind these absolutely terrible revenge games. Before I talk about the revenge games in question, we need some context to understand just who Tony Reed is, why he was no longer on the Chiefs, and why he was so upset and wanted to get revenge on his former squad. In 1977, the Chiefs spent their second-round pick in the NFL draft on the Colorado running back. Reed finished second in the Big 8 that season in rushing yards, and the Chiefs were hoping that bringing him into the fold would help bolster a rushing attack that finished just 22nd out of 28 teams in rushing yards and yards per carry, finishing in the bottom quarter of the league in both of those categories. And while Reed made an immediate impact during the 1977 season, where he had over 500 rushing yards and 4 yards per carry, and was a significant part as to why the rushing attack improved from 22nd in yards per carry to 9th, it was in 1978 that Reed would have a season to remember. Prior to the start of the 1978 season, the Kansas City Chiefs hired a brand new head coach in Marv Levy, and under Levy, the Chiefs' offense centered around the wing T formation. The wing T was centered around running the football as many times as possible, and that season, the Chiefs did just that, as they ran it an astonishingly high 663 times, coming out to an average of over 41 times per game. They even had a game against the Cincinnati Bengals on opening day, which they won 24-23, where they called 90 plays, and 69 of them were runs. And Reed thrived in the system, as in 1978, he led the team with 206 carries for 1,053 yards. Not only did he find the end zone 5 times, and not only did he average a really high 5.1 yards per carry, but he was a threat in the passing game as well, recording 48 receptions for 483 yards. When the season ended, Tony Reed had 1,536 yards from scrimmage, which was third in the NFL, only behind future Hall of Famers Walter Payton and Tony Dorsett. This meant that Tony Reed led the AFC in this category, proving himself as one of the most dynamic threats in the game. Let's put that 1978 season of his into perspective. At the time, Reed became just the second player in Chiefs history to ever have at least 1,500 yards from scrimmage in a single season. His 1,053 rushing yards was the third time in Chiefs franchise history, and the first time since the post-merger era that a player crossed the 1,000-yard mark, as he joined Abner Hayes, who did this in 1962 when the Chiefs were known as the Dallas Texans, and Mike Garrett, who did this in 1967. As a side note, if you want to learn more about the career of Mike Garrett, then click the card in the upper right corner. And he did all this on just 206 carries. There were 11 players in 1978 to have at least 1,000 yards rushing, and none of them had fewer carries than Reed did. In fact, when it came to carries, Reed was last by a lot, and as we would later find out, this would come to cause problems down the line. Even though the 1978 season was bad for the Chiefs, as they went 4-12 in Marv Levy's first year in charge, it was a great year for Tony Reed, who established himself that year as one of the shiftiest and most exciting players to watch in the NFL. The encore, however, was a bit disappointing. Reed wanted more carries after getting 1,000 yards and over 5 yards per carry in 1978, and instead, he got less. In the 11 games that Reed played in, he only got 113 rushing attempts. Reed averaged slightly under 13 carries per game in 1978 when he crossed the 1,000-yard mark, which is not a lot considering the offense that the Chiefs were running and considering how effective he was. And in 1979, he was getting slightly over 10 carries per game. The fact that his workload got reduced really bugged him, and what bugged him even more, aside from the fact that the Chiefs had another losing record in 1979, and aside from the fact that he only averaged 3.9 yards per carry compared to the 5.1 he was averaging the year before, was the fact that during a loss to the Steelers, he strained ligaments in his left knee and was forced to miss the final 5 games of the year. When 1980 rolled around and Reed was back from the injury, his relationship with the Chiefs continued to sour. he missed the start of training camp due to a contract issue, and held out alongside a few other players. While the issue got resolved, and while Reid didn't have to miss the start of the regular season, his workload continued to decrease. Granted, the Chiefs coaching staff didn't think that Reid was that good anymore, and was not the same player that he was prior to the knee injury. And to an extent, they had a point. Reid only averaged 2.6 yards per carry during the 1980 season, which was not only the lowest total of his career, but was half of what he was averaging in 1978 when he led the conference in yards from scrimmage. Still, Reid was not getting any work. He had no games in 1980 where he had more than 10 rushing attempts. He was primarily used as a receiving back by this point, as roughly 40% of his touches were in the passing game. Reid got just 68 carries during the 1980 season, and over the second half of the year, in those 8 games, got 2 carries or less in 7 of them. Even though the Chiefs were getting better, as they went 8-8 and finished with their first winning record since 1973, understandably, Reid was not happy that he was being phased out of the offense. And by the time he played his last game with the Chiefs, he was absolutely fuming. During the 1981 NFL Draft, the Chiefs and Broncos worked out a trade, where the Chiefs would receive a 3rd-round pick and a 4th-round pick in 1982, and in return, the Broncos, a team that finished in the bottom half of the league in rushing yards and yards per carry, and ranked 4th from the bottom in total yards of offense, would get Tony Reid. It was a bit of a gamble for the Broncos. They were giving up 2 somewhat valuable picks for a guy that hadn't done much in 2 years. But if it worked out, they would be getting the guy that was 2 years removed from leading the AFC in yards from scrimmage. For those curious, the 2 players that the Chiefs got were tackle Roger Taylor and linebacker Stuart Anderson. Taylor was off the Chiefs after 1 year, and Anderson never played a down for the team, so the Chiefs did absolutely nothing with this. However, the Broncos now had Tony Reid on their team, and Reid was so happy to be with the Broncos, partly because he played his college ball at Colorado, but mainly because he was excited that he was finally going to be utilized again. When asked about what it was like to be with the Broncos, he said that leaving the Chiefs and joining Denver was like Fantasy Island. He said, "When I was told about the trade, I was so excited I just couldn't talk. This is where I wanted to be. It's like being a rookie all over again." Reid's excitement continued throughout training camp, where he even said that he was in his prime and was hoping to have another season where he crossed the 1,000-yard mark. But even though he was on a new team, he was not letting go of his time with the Chiefs. He had something to prove to them. During training camp, Reid could not let go of the first time he ran for 1,000 yards and barely touched the ball. He said that he was upset that he hadn't been used much. With regards to his workload, he said, "At the time, I took it in stride, but in my own right, I'm a little bitter about it because I know what a 1,000-yard year means to a running back. There are a lot of running backs that come into the league and out of the league without 1,000 yards. He also talked about how his relationship with the coaching staff, both over playing time and a few other things, soured as time went on, although he didn't dive too much into the specifics. The good news was that in 1981, because the Broncos and Chiefs were in the same division, Tony Reid would have 2 chances to get revenge on his former team. The bad news was that his revenge tour absolutely sucked. Tony Reid had something to prove for the Chiefs. He wanted to show that he was not being utilized properly in Kansas City, and that he deserved more touches. His time with the Broncos, however, proved the exact opposite. On October 18, 1981, the Broncos traveled to Arrowhead Stadium for the first game of the series. And this was a pretty big game, as the Broncos entered atop the AFC West at 5-1, while the Chiefs were right behind at 4-2. First place in the division was on the line, and Reid did absolutely nothing. In a 28-14 loss, Reid got 4 carries and picked up just 8 yards. If you're doing the very easy math at home, this means that Reid averaged 2 yards per carry in the losing effort. He did nothing. The good news the second time that these teams met on December 6th was that the Broncos defended their home field and won the game, taking it 16-13 and being able to split the season series. The bad news was that Tony Reid was somehow even worse. Much like the first game against the Chiefs, he only had 4 carries. But at least in that first Chiefs game, as bad as that was, he had a positive yards per carry average. Here, he had 4 carries for -5 yards, meaning that he was losing more than 1 yard per carry every time he touched the ball. If you did nothing but spike the ball to the ground on every single play, you would have more yards than Tony Reid did on this day. It was the fewest rushing yards that Reid ever had in a game in his NFL career. This meant that over the 2 games against his former team, in the 2 meetings that Reid had against the Chiefs, he had 8 carries for 3 yards. That's it. For some perspective on how bad that is, with that yards per carry average, it would take 27 rushing attempts for Reid to pick up a first down. And it gets even worse. I looked at every running back that the Chiefs went up against in 1981 that had a minimum of 8 carries, just to see where Tony Reid ranked in terms of yards per carry. Now, keep in mind that the Chiefs had a great run defense that season. They finished 3rd in rushing yards allowed and 2nd in yards per carry allowed, only behind the New York Giants in that category. The Chiefs led the AFC in rushing yards and yards per carry allowed, and you can probably tell that with this graph just by how many guys are hovering around the 3 yard per carry mark. But at the very bottom, of the 21 qualified running backs, there sits Tony Reed, historically bad. And those revenge games pretty much sum up his tenure with the Broncos. Reed entered the 1981 season thinking that he was still in the prime of his career. However, as we all found out that year, that was not the case, as the Tony Reed of the 80s was a far cry from the Tony Reed of the 70s, where he was one of the more electrifying players in football. Reed did not have a single game where he carried the ball 10 or more times, as he touched the ball on 68 carries, which is exactly the same amount that he got in 1980 with the Chiefs. In total, he got a career-low 102 touches, as he averaged a career-low 9.3 yards per catch, a career-low 156 rushing yards, a career-low 2.3 yards per carry, and had a career-low 0 starts with 0 touchdowns. He also had a career-low 473 yards from scrimmage, and a career-low 4.6 yards per touch. Long story short, everything about this 1981 season with the Broncos was bad for Tony Reed. In 1982, the Broncos tried converting Reed to wide receiver as a last-ditch effort to figure out the best way to utilize his skill set and recoup the value from the 2 picks they gave up to get him. It wouldn't be the last time that head coach Dan Reeves would change a running back's position, although this one at least made sense. 1 year later, in 1983, he would try to change Rob Lytle, a running back under 6 feet, to tight end. That was a predictable failure, and you can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, a shaky and unimpressive preseason left Reed on the chopping block. Reed was cut after the 1982 preseason and would never play in the NFL again. Oddly enough, this is not the first time I've done a video about a Broncos player trying to get revenge on his former team, as I talked about when the Broncos played the Packers in 1971, and Don Horn, starting under center for the Broncos against the Packers, threw no touchdowns and 6 interceptions in the loss. You can learn more about that game by clicking the card in the upper right corner. It doesn't get much worse for a quarterback than that, but from a halfback perspective though, it's tough to do much worse than what Reed did in his 2 chances to show the Chiefs what they were missing out on. To go up against your former team and average less than half a yard per carry? I think it's safe to say that's not how Tony Reed drew that one up. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes, link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9, and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.